everyone for participating in this webinar today. As Chris mentioned, it's geared towards new data providers for the annual collection of the SHEF and Grapevine surveys through the State Support Database, what we'll call the SSDB, from here on out. I anticipate that my presentation will last no more than 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions in the system through the Q&A chat box. So just real quick, my goal for this webinar is to provide you with an overview of SHEF and Grapevine and help you understand why we do these projects. I'll also discuss the timeline and the data collection process, going through each page of the SSDB and how the system functions. I really want to focus kind of holistically on how the data collection system works to provide the data for both reports. I'm also going to go over a few changes that we made for this cycle, and also go over the 3 adjustments that we make to the data you provide each year. One of those adjustments is for inflation. The next one is for enrollment mix differences, and then we make an adjustment for cost of living differences across the states. And a little bit of history, some of you may know this, others may not, but I've been in your shoes. I was a data provider for 4 of the 6 years that I worked at the Colorado Department of Higher Education as their budget director. I took over from someone who gave me no information to go off of, and I'll be perfectly honest, I had no idea what SHEO was or what SHEF was or even what Grapevine was when I started this process. So all that is just to say that I have been in your shoes, and I do wish that someone had provided some context for me when I first started, and that really is why I decided that it made sense to do this webinar. I hope that the context provided today is beneficial to you. And just that's why I'm doing it. So we'll kind of jump right in. A little bit of history. So the 11th SHEF report was released last April. It was for fiscal year 2013. And the SHEF report, State Higher Education Finance Survey that SHEO puts out, it builds upon the work of a professor named Dr. Kent Halstead. And he did something called the Halstead Finance Survey. And he collected data going back to 1972. In the late 90s and 1998, Dr. Halstead just kind of abruptly stopped publishing his data and collecting his data. So for about 3 or 4 years, there was just no information, and people realized that that kind of state-level data on state support, tuition, and enrollment was beneficial. So our membership, your bosses, requested that SHEO undertake to do a similar survey, and then in 2003, we released our first one. So Dr. Halstead, after talking with SHEO, agreed to release his data. So that was kind of the starting point for the SHEF data that now goes back to 1980. And then, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the first SHEF report was released in 2004 for fiscal year 2003. A lot of the credit goes to David Wright, who's now with the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. He was an analyst at SHEO at the time, and he really undertook and led that project, developed some of the adjustments that I'll talk about, figured out what data to collect, and did a lot of pretty rigorous analysis to scrub and clean the Halstead data and make it so that it was, longitudinally accurate with the data that we were going to begin collecting through this process. And then a little bit more history, because the Grapevine survey comes in. So in 2010, we created the online data collection tool that you guys have seen, and is kind of what we're going to focus on for a lot of today, the SSDB. In 2010, that's when we created that, and then we aligned the SHEF survey and the Grapevine survey. So I remember before that, as a data provider for SHEF and as, working at a Department of Higher Education, I would get 2 separate requests, and so it was decided that since they were pretty similar, we would combine them. So what's the difference between the SHEF survey and the Grapevine survey? I think they're definitely related, and I kind of like how they work together. So my view of it is that the Grapevine survey is the first look at state appropriations in the current fiscal year, and we try to get that data as soon as possible. And the Grapevine then survey is the media tables that are released each year are just kind of two simple, Excel documents, PDFs that provide 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year looks at the overall appropriations and then the percent changes by state. There are no adjustments made for inflation there. They're just kind of straight up, here's the data, here's the numbers. And we try to release that. It's handled by Illinois State University, and they release that in December or early January. And that data goes back to 1960. That's a project that they've been handling since 1960. SHEF is, I would describe, is a more detailed look at the most current or the most recent completed fiscal year. So we're now collecting data for fiscal year 2014. And we wanted to get, in addition to state support, we want to know about local appropriations. We also want to get information on tuition revenue, and we also track enrollment. This report is typically released in March, and as I mentioned earlier, we've got data going back to 1980, and we've released the report. The first one was released for fiscal year 2003. So Grapevine is really your page one of the SSDB that we'll talk about in a little bit, and then SHEF is constructed from the full database. And just real quick, again, when I was a new data provider, I didn't know any of this. I thought it was good to share. So these are the metrics that we collect and we present in our SHEF report each year. But we look at state and local support. We look at educational appropriations. We calculate net tuition revenue. And those last two, ed appropriations and net tuition revenue, are done on a per FTE basis. So therefore, we collect FTE. And then we also do total education revenue on a per student basis. So those three metrics in the middle make up what we call the wave chart. And it's probably the thing that most everyone is most interested in the annual SHEF report. It's what the media always focuses on. And it tracks for the nation state and local support per student, tuition revenue per student, enrollment growth over a 25-year period. And so you can kind of look at that chart on the bottom right and see why we call it a wave chart. So another reason I thought it made sense for new data providers to kind of give a little history and talk about, I also want to talk about why it's important. And the last couple of years especially, the SHEF report has been released in the spring, March. It was released in April this last year. It always gets a lot of media attention, and it's gotten a lot more recently. And it's gotten attention from some pretty major media outlets. NPR ran a story 2 years ago. The Wall Street Journal have published pretty large articles based on the SHEF data each of the last 2 years. The Atlantic ran a couple kind of intriguing pieces 2 years ago, making some pretty interesting arguments, and the SHEF data was the basis for that. And so other uses, why we think that this is important and what we've seen in the last couple of years. Often, when I release the SHEF data and the report, the first couple days after that, I talk to the major national media outlets that I just mentioned and others, and I also talk to local reporters. I often get calls from, papers in Indianapolis and Portland, Oregon, and lots of the cities throughout the country wanting to know how their state's data compares to the national data, and that is presented there. As two examples, this last year we had major stories run in papers in Idaho and Oregon. So I think that that's another reason why this report is important. It's also, I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's been a number of proposals to create a new federal-state partnership that would provide matching dollars from the federal government for state support or for increased state support. SHEO has released one of those. Ironically, it did not use SHEF data. But two other organizations released these recently, these types of proposals. One was from ASCU, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and a think tank that goes by the name DEMOS also released one. And both of those proposals relied extensively on the SHEF data. So you're starting to see the data in the SHEF report, being used to try to drive some policy proposals. Another example, the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, uses College Board data, Grapevine data, and SHEF enrollment data, and kind of does a SHEF report, but does it based on the appropriations of the current year to try to get a sense of like what a more current estimate of these metrics is. And they've done that for the past 2 years. Finally, we always try to release the SHEF report in early March. We have not quite been successful in the last year, but because we think it can be used for context for state budget negotiations and also state policy negotiations going on during legislative sessions that for most states are going on at that time. And one more note, it was used by the Obama administration's education policy staff for some of the analyses that they've been doing. So that's it for history and for kind of my sales job I'm trying to do to you guys as new data providers. But again, I really think it would have helped me to have known this when I was in your shoes. So now we're going to dive into the process. So I've talked about the Grapevine and SHEF reports, and I imagine most of you have logged into the system and kind of played around in there at least a little bit. I know many of the names here, you're not first-time providers, that you provided data for 1 to 2 years already. But here's the due dates, which we pushed back a little bit this year. Page 1 for the Grapevine data is due on October 31st. So I'm not very technically savvy, but I do have a clip art of some Halloween stuff there. Since it is Halloween, that's next Friday. And then December 5th is when the full survey is due, and that'll provide us with all the SHEF data that we can build our report. And so the reason for the 2 different deadlines is that we want to release the Grapevine data in early December. That's kind of always the goal. And then this year for SHEF, we're really hoping that late February it'll be possible to release the SHEF report, allowing it to be context for budget discussion in most of the states. And so our fingers are crossed that that can happen, and that's where we totally rely on you guys to provide us with the data as soon as possible. And I know some states, there's a couple of states on a different fiscal year, and it's really hard for them, but I know that everyone does their best. The best way to let me know that your data is complete is to check those check boxes indicating that on the bottom of each page. And by doing so, I don't have to bug you with annoying phone calls. So each page has a checkbox like the one on the bottom left of this slide, this page complete and ready to publish. And then the last page has the full survey complete and ready to publish. And by checking those pages, those checkboxes on each page, I know that the data is ready to go. I should also mention that there's actually 2 to 3 times once the data is finalized where we give the data providers and even the SHEOs a chance to review, because we know that this report is really critical and we want it to be as accurate as possible. So let's say you're a new data provider. So your first step, you've never done this before, you're filling in for somebody who's probably taken another job somewhere, or maybe retired. So you pull up those copious notes and documentation that your predecessor kept. And this is my bad joke. I know that that probably didn't happen. So what is the best step 1? So I suggest you just log into the SSDB, the data collection tool, and begin to familiarize with the system, how it works, and what the data being requested, what the data is, like what we're actually asking for. And also, I highly recommend that you begin documenting this process, not just for your predecessor, if there is one 5 or 10 years down the road, but so next year it's easier and much more familiar for you. So the process, I know I've had phone calls with folks and they're really struggling on 1 or 2 pieces of data, and we really don't want this to be particularly onerous or burdensome. When I provided the data in Colorado, I recall it was about 4 hours of work for me. Now, Colorado is actually a pretty simple state when it comes to SHEF, and I know many of your states are way more complicated. But if this is seeming to be overly burdensome, please call me, and we can figure out how to make it less so, because we really don't want that to be the case. So a couple of do's and don'ts, and then we're actually going to kind of walk through the whole survey holistically. So these are things that I've learned, as I've thought about my own experience, and then having phone calls with folks that have been in your shoes the last couple of years that are struggling to figure it out. I think that these are just some tips that I wanted to provide. So what should you do? I think the most important thing is to think holistically about the whole survey instrument and really what the SHEF data are all about. What are we really asking for? What questions are we trying to answer? You know, we're trying to build to those metrics that I shared earlier. So what data is SHEO asking for, and how do the pages build off one another? And I'm going to go through that in more detail page by page in a second. I just think that's super important. What you shouldn't do is take a look at the data your predecessor provided and try to tie out to the penny, you know, or the dollar amount, that exact amount from your predecessor the year before, because that's just not the way to do it, because you're gonna the number's gonna be a little different than what you think you think it might be, and that's just gonna lead to confusion and then you know, kind of wasted effort and a lot of frustration. And I've seen that happen in some states, and once I had a call with them and talked holistically about the whole survey, it was much easier for them. And then I want you to call me with any questions or shoot me emails. I'm happy to talk through anything or walk through your assumptions. And also, one more tip for a don't. Do not think you have to fill out every single column or every single every field, every row. Many states do not have to do that. There are a few that do, and there's the really complicated ones. But for most states, they're not filling out all the different categories. So now I want to kind of walk through each of the pages in the survey and just highlight a few things. I know these screenshots aren't the best. It was the best I could do. But I imagine that everyone has already logged in and seen this, so hopefully it'll be pretty straightforward. So this is page one, and page one is the starting point for the SHEF collection, and it's also the only place you're going to give any data that's going to be used for the Grapevine survey, the Grapevine report. It's the only page where there's a 2015, trying some fancy stuff here. So this is the only page where there's a column with 2015. Every other page only goes to 2014, the most recently completed fiscal year. And so this is the only place that you'll have any Grapevine data, which is why it's due earlier, because we want to get that released in early December if possible. It's also the starting point for the SHEF survey, and it's important to remember, and I'll talk about this through each of the other pages, that the other pages you'll report specific types of state support being used for specific purposes. And anything that you report in those other pages that state support needs to be included in the totals that you report here, because here we're starting out with state support for all higher education, and then as we go through the survey, we'll figure out how much state support goes to public higher education, how much goes for educational appropriations at public institutions. So this is our starting point, so that this is the totals. And then the rest of the report, when we're dealing with state support, the rest of the survey, those dollar amounts will be backed out of these numbers to arrive at different metrics. Page two. Again, here's where we start to make adjustments to the state support for higher education. On the top of the page, the top half, we have 4 different adjustments. I'm trying this fancy Adobe thing, and it seems to be working. These adjustments are for continuing or adult education for non-credit, independent operating expenses. So if your state provides any dollars that go to private institutions for operations, you would report that number here. Any aid to students attending independent institutions. So if you have a financial aid program and students attending independent private institutions are eligible, you would get that amount of money that the state awarded each year and put that here. And then aid to students attending out-of-state institutions. And again, not every state has any funding going to these categories, but those 4 things are subtracted from the total on page 1, and that gets us to the state support for public higher education. And then the second half of this page, these are just kind of additional things that we're asking for. They don't actually drive anything on the SHEF report, so we're gonna skip it for the purposes of today. Page 3. So page 3 is where we get local appropriations at the top. And we assume, so these are dollars typically coming from property tax revenues, and we assume they go to students or to the two-year sector, to local district community colleges. And about 30 states have that type of funding for community colleges, so not everyone reports information here. If you do have local appropriations that go to something other than the two-year sector, please let us know that in the comment box, but otherwise we assume that these fundings are going to the two-year sector. In the middle of this page is where we collect what we call RAM. So RAM is research, agriculture extension programs, and hospitals, and then the medical schools, research, ag, and medical, basically. And these are state support dollars that would be included in page 1 that we want to back out as we get to the educational appropriations level for public institutions. Not all states have these as well. Many do. So if the state provides any money for research, you would include that here. If they provide any money for those agriculture extension programs that many states have, or the land-grant institutions typically have, that would be listed here. Funding for hospitals would be put here, as well as any funding that goes to medical or like osteopathic or veterinary schools, those really specific medical and vet schools, basically. We want to collect all those. We call that RAM, and then that gets backed out, and that gets us to the educational appropriations total that will then do ed appropriations per FTE by dividing it by the FTE that you provide. So a couple of reasons why we want to back that out for ed appropriations. Not all states have medical schools, as I'm sure you know, or vet programs, and there is a significant variance in the size of the funding for those schools. Some are very, very, very well funded, and others are not. And so to make the data more comparable across the states, and to get a sense of the state funding that is going to the general education of students at institutions within a state, we wanted to back that out. The bottom third of page 3 is where we get our tuition revenue. So right here, we're asking for public tuition revenue. Our starting point here is gross tuition for all students attending public institutions of higher education in your state. We want tuition from resident and non-resident students. It's all included, undergrad and grad students. We don't break that out. There's been some talk that we should, but one of the original intents of SHEF was to get basic state-level data, and to ask that to be broken out would definitely complicate things, and I don't think that's a road we want to go down. So from gross tuition, we want to get to net tuition for how we calculate it. So we ask for any institutional discounting or waivers, tuition waivers provided. You could list that here. We ask for any state funding for financial aid for students attending public institutions, because that's reported on page 1. It's included on the state and local support side, and we kind of be double counting it if we included it here as well. So we assume that that goes to cover tuition expenses for qualified students. So you'd report that here in the row listed as state public aid. And then because we're backing out the appropriations for medical and vet students or vet schools, we want to back out the tuition revenue that comes from those students. So that's reported under medical tuition. And then finally, any tuition for debt service is reported here as well. So we then calculate net tuition revenue by starting with the gross tuition, backing out discounts and waivers, backing out state public aid, and backing out medical tuition. The tuition for debt service is included in net tuition, but it's not included in the total educational revenue metric. I wasn't here when that decision was made, but it's how it's been done, and that seems to be what most people have accepted, so that's how we do it. All right. Racing through the survey. Really the last page of data that you provide that goes into the SHEF report is page 4, and this is just where we get the enrollment information. So we want the annual FTE at public institutions that corresponds with the fiscal years that you provided earlier. So we ask for gross FTE based on 30 credit hours for semester institutions, for undergraduates, 24 credits for graduates, and then for the vocational technical programs that lead to certificates, we want 900 contract hours equals 1 FTE, and I think those are pretty standard calculations. So we asked for the gross FTE, and then again, keeping everything consistent, we want to then know your medical FTE that corresponds with the tuition revenue you just reported on page 3. Report that here, and we will back that out to get to the public FTE net of medical. So this last page, which looks a little incomplete because there's no data has been populated in this blank survey that I've been sharing with you, but there would normally be the fiscal years across the top like the other pages. So this is this is like our check page, and this is where we crunch all the numbers within the database that the SSDB feeds into. And for your data, you will see here, once you fill the survey out, what the educational appropriations are and the total educational revenue, and then those numbers per FTE, unadjusted and then adjusted. I'm going to talk here shortly about the 3 adjustments that we make to the data. But in about 2 weeks, I'm going to finalize those adjustments, and they'll be uploaded into the system. So as you fill out the survey, you'll get a sense of what the per student numbers are, and you can let me know if they look wonky or they just don't look right. We want to know that, and we want to figure out, because you should have a general sense of how the numbers really are in your state just based on your experience. And then lastly, on page 6, so this page was added when we started it was added to the SHEF survey when we converted the online collection system. And this year we moved the state support sector breakouts to page 1. And I'll talk about that in more detail later, why we did that. But we're really hoping to get net tuition revenue broken out by the 2-year and 4-year sectors, and also the enrollment broken out. And this is challenging for some states and a breeze for others. It's challenging for a lot of states because they don't necessarily have access to the financial aid award information to know, how many students, what the total for 2-year sector students and 4-year sector is. So this data is not used in our report. We hope to get it, and I want to work with you to make it as easy as possible. And if it's a big problem for your state, please call me, and and if you have any ideas of how to make it easier, like how could we ask for it that would enable you to provide it more easily, please let me know. This page, these data will not be used in our report, but we get a lot of requests for them, and we are hopeful that someday we will be able to use it. All right, I'm going to talk really quickly about the couple of changes that we made to the SSDB this year, and then I'm going to go over our 3 adjustment factors, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 changes, and really only 2 are changes, and one is just an emphasis on something that's always been there. The first change we made this year was we moved that sector breakout for the state support numbers from page 6 to page 1. So I just showed you page 6. And last year, if you provided data, you know that state support breakout was listed on page 6. We thought it made sense to move it to page 1 and make it due with the first due date because it divvies up the workload a little more evenly. And those sector breakouts were a part of the original Grapevine survey. So before we merged the 2 systems, the Grapevine data was actually broken out by sector. And we just thought it made more sense to include that there because I think that sector breakout is easier to provide than the other 2 components, and we really do want to focus on it this year as part of the Grapevine report. So and then, as you saw on page 6 just a second ago, we are still asking for the net tuition revenue and FTE breakouts on that page. So the second change is just a simple button to push on page 1 to indicate whether your state enacts an annual budget or a biennial budget. That's something that you guys know off the top of your heads, and we get asked that question. I got asked that question twice in the last year, and I thought it just made sense to collect that information just so we have it, and I can respond more accurately when I get a question on how many states do that and how do an annual and how many do a biennial. And then the last change, which is not really a change, comment box have always been available on each page. But we really want to encourage you all to use these, especially if there's something that needs to be explained with your data. And the example I will give is the state of Illinois, which Illinois accurately fills out the SHEF data, providing the data that we asked for, and they do a great job of that. And they show this major increase in funding over the last 5 years. They're one of only 3 states with an increase according to our data. And what they report is accurate based on what we ask for, but it's not really accurate to what's going on there. Their pension program is so underfunded across the entire state that they're actually cutting funding for operations for their institutions, but putting money towards their pension programs to backfill underfunding over like 50 years, basically. So Illinois provided us with a footnote to the report, and if there are other situations that are similar to that in your state, you can provide us a footnote language here, and we can use that in the report as needed. So again, it's not a change per se, but we do want to encourage you to use these. So just a couple more slides. I just want to talk quickly about the adjustment factors, because when I think back to my time as a data provider, I didn't know that SHEO was adjusting the data. I knew they adjusted it for inflation, but I didn't realize about the other deal. So our inflation adjustment, which we use to take all dollars for all the back years up to, we'll take them up to 2014 for this year's report. We call that HECA, and that's the Higher Education Cost Adjustment. And we created this measure using 2 other existing federal indices, the Employee Cost Index and the Gross Domestic Product Implicit Price Deflator. So the thinking was we wanted to develop an alternative to the Consumer Price Index and also to HEPI, which was the Higher Education Price Index, which still exists, but doesn't get used that often anymore. We wanted to develop a mean to account for the market basket of goods that higher education must purchase, and most of that is salaries for professors and faculty and staff, personnel costs. So we created HECA using these 2 existing appropriations, and what we do is we take the dollars up to the current year. So let's say for the 2012 report, we would have an appropriation of $1,000 in 2011. We would divide that amount by HECA for that year, which is 0.9824, and then that takes it up to 2012 dollars of 1,018. So over the course of a year, your $1,000 appropriation is inflated $18 to get to the next level. So when I first came to SHEO and started doing this, there was an analysis that said that HECA was misleading, and argued that it allows higher education institutions to justify more support because it has historically grown more quickly than CPI and therefore overstates the amount of support institutions need in order to keep up with inflation. So that was the critique. And at the same time, the SHEF data and the SHEF report was starting to get a lot more media attention, and it was kind of being used to talk about what's happening to tuition increases. And so the critique that we got on HECA was that it's a meaningless figure for families struggle to pay tuition costs, because it doesn't matter what the cost of the institutions are, it matters what the costs for families is to pay tuition. So our response to that, and I do think this is good information for you to have, is that the primary cost at institutions is still personnel, and SHEO's intent with the SHEF report was to measure trends in revenue for educational delivery, is to understand how much revenue institutions need to cover necessary expenditures. And in that respect, it makes sense as a measure of inflation. It's actually, ironically, HECA is actually growing more slowly than CPI lately because it's focused on salaries, and salaries have actually not grown, as I'm sure most of you know, since the economic downturn and the Great Recession. Since 2010, CPI has actually grown faster than the HECA measure, although over 25 years, HECA is still a little higher. SHEO, we totally agree that CPI is a better measure of tuition rate increases for students and families, but It was never SHEF's intent to measure that. All right, last slide, and then we have time for questions. The last two adjustments we make, and this is for the state level data when we present all 50 states and, all the data for all 50 states and all the metrics. So the thinking here with enrollment mix is that some states have a much larger community college system, or some do not have hardly any community college system. So the enrollment mix index adjusts the per student data that we get from you guys for differences in that mix and the differences in costs across those institutions among the state. And it's an index, so 1.0 is the national average, and states either fall below that if they have a larger proportion of the community college, or they're higher if they have a larger proportion at research institutions. And we pull that data every 2 years from iPads. So it won't be updated this year. Only HECA will be updated this year. And then the last adjustment we make is for cost of living. The thinking here being that, it's a lot more expensive to live in a place like Massachusetts or Hawaii versus, perhaps Arkansas. Therefore, that might drive some of the salary requirements, and it might drive some of the differences in appropriations. So we make a similar adjustment for that, and that is from a professor named Michael Berry, who did this study in 2001, I believe, and we haven't, 2003, I'm sorry, and we haven't found a better, more up-to-date one, but that's an area that I'm beginning to investigate. If you have ideas, please let me know. I went a little longer than I intended, but there is still plenty of time for questions. I hope this has been helpful. So as Chris mentioned, you can ask away using the Q&A box. If you want to call me or email me and have a private conversation about any issues in your state, that's totally fine too. But I'm available for questions.